I have a story about my grandfather who served in World War I. Now, I called my grandfather, my father's father, Papa. And I have a picture of Papa holding me when I was just a little baby. And we are gazing into each other's eyes, and it is clear that it was love at first sight. By the time I was walking and talking, I had Papa around my little finger. One of the favorite things that we did together was take walks. Papa, back in those days, still smoked cigars, but he was not allowed to smoke them in the house. So he would go out for walks and smoke a cigar on his walk. And I would go with him. We'd walk through the neighborhood and usually to the grocery store. He went almost daily to pick up something at the grocery store. And I would pull my red wagon until I got tired. And then I would sit in my wagon and I would say, Papa, you can pull me now. And he delightedly would. Papa was a fireman. Well, at least that's how I understood it as a child. I knew he was in fire protection, which as a child meant obviously he was a fireman. And besides that, even though he never wore a uniform or went anywhere near a fire station that I knew of, I had 3 clues that he was a fireman. For starters, he gave my little brother and I coloring books of Sparky the Firehouse Dog. And inside those coloring books were fire safety tips. I also had my favorite toy at Nanny and Papa's house. It was a fire truck. Not a little tiny truck you could play with, a big truck that you could pedal. You could ride this truck. And this was the 1960s, so it wasn't made of flimsy plastic. It was a solid metal push pedal fire truck. When my little brother and I were small enough, we could both sit together in the seat and together push those pedals. And as we got bigger, and I, as the eldest, would take the firefighter's seat in the driver's seat and pedal, there was enough room on the back for my little brother to hang on, ready for the next pretend fire emergency to jump off and start the rescue. But the real clincher, the way I knew Papa was a fireman, was because in their house, a ranch house in Wilmette, Illinois, they had a laundry chute. They had a little door in the wall that you could open, and you could put dirty clothes or your Barbies or your favorite stones, and down they would go down that laundry chute, and they'd end up in the basement. And Nanny would, not quite so delightedly, bring up those Barbies and rocks. Now, we weren't really allowed to play in the basement, so I didn't actually have a chance to explore and discover it for myself, but I knew that if they had that laundry chute, there had to be a fireman's pole in the basement as well. And that was how Papa would get ready into the fire truck and go off to emergencies. I think I had it kind of mixed up in my mind between the firehouse pole and Batman's pole. But I knew there was something magical about it, and Papa was a fireman. Well, it wasn't until I was in high school and was studying the First World War that I learned that Papa had served in the First World War. But I also learned from my father that he never talked about the war. And it's true, he never did. But he did, at the time of the war, write. He wrote a journal on the back of the photographs that his friends and family sent him. Paper was at a shortage. This was what he had. He wrote brief notes on the back of those photographs, and he sent letters home. And both of those things, the photograph journals and those letters home, were saved. And it's from those that I know about his experiences in the First World War. Now, my papa's real name was Raymond Oscar Matson. He was born February 14th, 1895 in Chicago, Illinois. He was a first-generation Swedish American on his father's side and a second-generation Swedish American on his mother's side. He grew up in the North Park area of Chicago, which at that time was a thriving Swedish American community. In April 1917, the United States rather belatedly declared war on Germany and joined the Great War, the war to end all wars, the war that was supposed to have ended in just a couple of months, but had gone on already for 3 years in Europe. The United States changed its staunch isolationist opinion and joined the war. And in September, Ray enlisted and became a corporal, later sergeant, in a machine gun battalion. He was sent to Camp Grant for training and then to New Jersey, out of which he was shipped across the ocean and landed in Brest, France. Of course, his letters home, he couldn't tell his folks, his friends, where he was, what exactly he was doing. All of his letters were censored. But in his notes on the back of those photographs, he would mention the places he went and how he was feeling. And one of the things was he was always hungry. He and the troops, there was not enough food, or not enough for them with all the marching that they did in 1917, 1918. They weren't being transported on trucks. They marched everywhere that they went. He would buy fruits and nuts from the French when he had a chance. And of course, he was at the front, being in the machine gun battalion, in trench warfare of World War I. Two sides facing each other across a piece of land, trying to win a little bit more of the land on one side or the other, while lobbying these terrific automated weapons, machine guns, artillery shells, mustard gas, back and forth at each other. He fought in 5 battles directly on the front. And then on November 10th, 1918, Peace talks had already started, but the American generals did not want to let go of the offensive. They did not want to let up on the Germans and give them any reason not to be coming to the table for the peace talks. And November 10th, 1918 was the worst that Ray had experienced in that entire war. Shells were exploding everywhere, artillery fire coming across, back and forth. The fighting was so fierce that they could only have one man at the machine gun to protect it, while the others took shelter, such as it was in the trenches, and would switch off. Ray was continually covered with dirt and debris and mud as shells exploded all around him. It was just a miracle that he wasn't hit directly himself. 5 infantrymen who were trying to move forward across that land took shelter in their trench. Ray was just around the bend when a shell made a direct hit exactly where those 5 infantrymen were, and the men, bodies, dirt exploded up into the air. Ray immediately scrambled out of the trench, running across enemy fire to see what aid he could render. 2 of the men were clearly dead. 2 others were badly wounded. And the 5th didn't have a scratch on him, but had no idea what had happened or where he was or who he was. He was thoroughly shell-shocked. Ray was starting to give first aid treatment to one of the wounded men whose arm was badly injured when he became conscious and asked Ray, "Where's Nelson? What's happened to Nelson?" And Ray looked, and Nelson was right beside him, one of the dead men, his face and body so covered with shrapnel that his features were completely unrecognizable. Ray was put in mind of a friend back home, August Nelson. His father had recently written him about. He was serving too, maybe was here as well, right here in Marshville, France. Ray looked at the body and he had the general size and build of August Nelson, but he could not tell if it was the August Nelson he knew or another Nelson. Ray got all 3 of the men who were still alive back into the relative safety of the trenches. And the fighting just continued on until the next morning, November 11th, 1918. Ray started the morning with a gas mask on, but there was no fighting. It was eerily quiet and still. Armistice had been declared. A little prematurely, as it took another week and a half before the Treaty of Versailles to actually be signed. And the word hadn't truly gotten out officially to the men, though they were marched off the battlefield. They were billeted in shacks with the French, who welcomed them and fed them. But It was just rumors of peace to them, and it was several days before they trusted that this was peace, peace at last. Ray wrote home to his father about that battle, the only battle he wrote home about, because of the mention of August Nelson, who he had later determined when he'd spent more time looking at that body that it wasn't the August he knew, another Nelson. He's thought at first he might be home in time for Christmas. His mother had sent him a letter asking what he might like sent for Christmas. And he had said no clothes. He had as much as he needed in the way of clothes, but some good food would be nice. Candy, preferably. But maybe he'd be home for Christmas. But no, they were stepped in one place to another. It's kind of following the Germans as they retreated back home. At first, he and his men were suffering from colds. It was November, winter coming on. They were giving themselves home remedies of building up a fire and toasting bread over the flames and boiling up black coffee. He was given an opportunity for his first bath in 8 weeks, but turned it down because of his cold. But he wrote his mother that he was looking forward to having a real bath when he got home. He expected it would take several Turkish baths before he felt clean again. And he wrote his father that he was as well as he had ever been, morally, mentally, physically, and spiritually, in large part due to the letters and support he received from his family and friends back in North Park, Chicago area. It was 6 months before Ray was shipped back home again. After the war, he went back to school and got his bachelor's of science in fire protection engineering. In 1922, he married Anna Nivel, my grandmother, Nanny, one of the young women, one of the friends from North Park who he had corresponded with throughout the war. He married her in 1922 after he had graduated from college. And in 1923, he was awarded a Distinguished Service Medal, a Distinguished Service Cross for his actions on November 10th, 1918, rescuing his comrades and encouraging his company by his actions. He didn't want to go to DC to get that medal. He was embarrassed by it. And it was enough to live through. He didn't want to have to dwell on it. Only thing he ever said about it was that he only did what anyone would have done. While he was over in France, especially after the actual battles when peace was there, he saw some of the sights, a few castles. He remarked in his letters home about the picturesque countryside. But his main takeaway was that the US of A was good enough for him, and he had no desire to go back across the ocean again. And he never did. Though he did take many road trips across the country in the United States. And he lived his life, doing what anyone would or could do. At his convocation, when he was studying to be his degree for fire protection engineering, they were to pair up 2 by 2 to cross the stage, and there was a young Black woman who was a student, and no one would be her partner, and Ray was. He chose to go and walk with her. And I know because he would also take the widowed woman upstairs at the apartment building they retired to. He would take her groceries upstairs. So I know he made a friend and chatted and asked how her day was and what she was studying. He helped my parents buy their home in Guelph, Ontario, the house I grew up in. Ray Oscar Matson spent his life doing what anyone would do, but caring about and for other people.